Hello guys, welcome to the 7th session of the API.AI tutorials for beginner. In this session we will understand the what is fulfillment in the API.AI and setting up in the agent. Fulfillment allows us to send the request to the API and via which we can perform the some operation and the return the response. This operation may include the database operation, call to third-party API, or just a simple processing of the parameter. And it will generate the response which we'll use in the our chatbot by API.AI. Fulfillment is just a webhook. For deploying the service, we can use the our own API and the servers for hosting, as well as using the Google Cloud, Heroku, Microsoft Azure, and many more cloud deployments. Throughout this section, I will use the PHP, Python, C#, and the Node.js for creating the fulfillment and deploy it on the Google Cloud. Because of the API.AI is already create our one project in the Google Cloud, so it would be easy to use the GCloud. We can also implement the authentication for the our webhook. For this, basic authentication or the header based authentication can be used. Limitation of the fulfillment for API.AI is the timeout for the service response is only 5 seconds. If your application took the longer time, then it will display the blank response. And you can return only data up to 64 kbs. However, for most of case, it is not a big deal because in chatbot we create the small message, not huge paragraphs. API.AI will use the post method to call the our deployment app and pass the data in the body of the JSON format. On a server side, after performing the operation, we need to return the data in the JSON format. JSON format for both request and response are predefined. Here is the example of the request and response. Every request includes the same data structure. First is the ID that represents the unique ID of the request. Next is the timestamp, which contains the full date time including the time zone on which request is sent. Then it is a language that we specify while creating the agent. Status contains the status of the request, which represent the HTTP status code and the message. Session ID is used to identify the conversation uniquely. Result is the main object, which contains the source from which we send the request. Resolve query contains the query that user write. Speech contains the text that user said. Parameter contains all of the entities or the parameter that are passed from the intent. Context contains the data that are stored in the context of the intent. We will learn more about the context in the later session. Metadata contains the details about the intent from which request is sent. Fulfillment contains the data about the response, but in case of the request it will be blank obviously. Note that when we are creating the client using the API.AI SDK, we will got the entire request object, not the response only. Request object itself contains the response in the fulfillment. Here is the example of the response, in which speech contains the text that will be a play if the user talk with the our bot instead of the typing. Display text contains the text that will be a display on the bot. Usually for most of case, both will contain the same value. Data contains the some additional data that you want to pass. It will not used by the API.AI itself, but it may require by the other bot. Context out. Context out contains the data that will be added into the context after these requests. Source specify the data source for that request. Follow up event contain the detail about the event that will be fired after this request. If you want to passing the follow-up event, then API.AI will ignore the display text, speech and the data. In this section, we will pass the two number from the parameter to the our API, which will be built in the PHP, C#, Node.js or the Python, and from which we will return the sum of those two numbers. For this session, I am going to create the new intent and setting up the fulfillment detail. Let's switch to the browser, create a new intent with the name calc demo. Here user will say the sum of 10 and 20. You can see that the number and number 1 are added automatically. Let's change those name. I'm going to use the num1 and the num2 for the number 2 and save it. Click on the fulfillment from the left side menu. Here we need to enable the fulfillment, and we need to specify the URL on which our operation will be performed and response will be returned. As I said previously, you can pass the basic authentication detail and the additional parameter along with this request. I'm going to write the localhost URL temporarily and save it. And now open the our calc demo intent and scroll down to the fulfillment section and check the use webhook. API.AI will not use the fulfillment by default for the all of the intent. If you want to enable the fulfillment for the particular intent, then you need to check this box and save it. Let's see what we are learning in this session. Fulfillment allows us to send the request to the API, and we will use its response to the our bot. Here are the simple example of the request and response. We have created the new intent for this example, in which we have passed the two parameters and check the use webhook checkbox. In the fulfillment page, we have enabled the webhook and specify the URL that we want to use. Now I am pasted the temporary page. We will update it in the next sessions. Thanks for watching. Have a nice day. If you have any doubt, feel free to contact me.